Hello, and welcome to the 15th lesson in our Judges series. This is Judges chapter 16 today, which is it's our Samson and Delilah story. The second part of this. There's a very short story in between, a very short story, and then we move into the Samson and Delilah story. But before we move into that, let me go ahead and open us with some prayer. Most gracious and loving God, in all that we do, watch over us and guide our lives. Help us today to gather wisdom from your word, to enhance our lives, to increase our benefit to the planet, our benefit to creation, our benefit to each other. Watch over us today, guide our minds, guide our spirits. Help us to find a deeper and more meaningful understanding of you. In all these things, we thank you and we praise your name. Amen. Well, kind of a recap, just a very short recap. The last lesson we had was the final story of Samson and his previous marriage. And then as we move forward now, we have another story. We have another story about another woman that Samson meets. This is the second woman in Samson's life. Let's go ahead and begin the story. This is Judges chapter 16, beginning with verse 1. Once Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute and went into her. The Gazites were told, "Samson has come here." So they circled around and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They kept quiet all night, thinking, "Let us wait until the light of the morning, then we will kill him." But Samson lay only until midnight. Then at midnight he rose up, took hold of the doors of the city gate and the two posts, pulling them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. So we have this little snippet story here, and Samson, one day while traveling around, he's near Gaza, which is again one of the five Philistine cities. This is one of the five major Philistine cities. So he goes there near this Philistine city, and he sees a prostitute, and he goes to her, and he pays her for the services of the day. And when the people from Gaza, the men in Gaza, heard that Samson was in the village or in the town here, they decided, we'll set up an ambush for him. Now we need to recognize now at this point here that it isn't just Samson against a few Philistines. He has now enraged the entire nation of the Philistines. The whole Philistine empire, the whole Philistine nation is upset at him. Remember, he burned their fields using foxes and so forth. He burns their fields, he burns their wheat or their grain crops, he burned their olive crops, and he burned their grape crops. So they're kind of ticked at him, and so this is no longer just a one man against a few Philistines. This is now a whole nation against a single Israelite, a single Danite, Samson. So the men of Gaza decide they're going to lay a trap for him, and so they circle around the town so that he wouldn't see them, and they come back around to the gates of the city, and they hide there, laying in wait for him, thinking that he'll be here, he'll come out in the morning, and we'll attack him and kill him, and that'll be the end of it. And so while they're there, Samson has decided or has moved forward and is leaving, and it's midnight. And so he's leaving several hours before they were expecting him. Well, as he leaves, of course, they don't see him or hear him because he is coming. They're not expecting him. Maybe they're dozing, whatever. But he gets to the gate, and he goes to the doors of the city gate, and he pulls the doors off. along with the two posts that hold it up, along with the bar that puts it into place, and he puts it all up on his shoulders and he carries it off. And he takes it to the top of the hill near Hebron. This is an act of, again, this is an act of a superhero. These are the gates of a city. These are, these would be able to hold up against siege weapons. And yet here it is that Samson just manages to pull them apart, pick them up, and carry them 35 miles uphill to Hebron. This could very well be one of those stories, though, that explains something that was already there. And they decided, well, here's a good story that kind of matches this and tells us here, this is how this got here. Maybe there was already a gate post and a gate and all of that, doorposts and all of that for a gate, for a city gate near where Hebron. Maybe it's the ruins of a former city that's no longer there and everything is left, or everything is gone but the gate posts, or and again, this is an attempt, maybe this is an attempt just to explain something that was already there in Hebron, in front of Hebron. But regardless of how that is, the story presents us here that this superhero carried the doors to the city 35 miles uphill and planted them in front of the city of Hebron. So, Samson escapes another trap. And we begin our next cycle in the story, the third and final episode of the Samson story. And this is the story of Delilah, as how Samson meets Delilah and how Delilah becomes his downfall. Picking up now with verse 4. After this he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, "Coax him and find out what makes his strength so great, and how we may overpower him, so that we may bind him in order to subdue him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me, what makes your strength so great, and how you could be bound so that one could subdue you?" Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that are not dried out, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." Then the lords of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not dried out, and she bound him with them. While men were lying in wait in an inner chamber, she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of fiber snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. So as we move forward now with our story, we meet Delilah. So after that incident with the prostitute, he's now he's back in Danite, or he's actually back in more or less Judah territory here still. The valley of Sorek reaches about 35 miles. It's about 30 or so miles southwest of Jerusalem, and stretches about 35 miles heading toward what would be Philistine territory of the day. So this is where the woman lives. She's probably a Philistine, although the story doesn't tell us that. She's probably a Philistine because she's living in Philistine territory. And her name is Delilah. Well, they know that Samson apparently has been visiting with her, and the Philistines find out, and they decide that they're going to figure out how they can get him subdued. So they come to her, and they coax her, or they tell her, here, coax him to find out what makes his strength so great and how we can overpower him, so that we can bind him in order to subdue him. And we'll each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So there are 5 major cities. There are 5 lords of the Philistines, so that's 5,500 pieces of silver that she'll receive. There are about 10 pieces of silver, which would be considered an annual wage, which would be about 10 pieces of silver. And so since there are 5,500 pieces of silver, that's quite a number of years' worth of income that she's receiving here. And so that's quite a bit that they've offered her to turn Samson over to them. So there is apparently no real love here between Delilah and Samson, because she is readily willing to submit to having him arrested. So they come to her, and instead of, remember the first wife, they threatened. They said, you know, if you don't tell us this, we're going to burn you out, you and your father, and we'll just wipe you out. And, well, of course, that ends up what happens to her, because although she does exactly what they want her to do, it all turns around on them, and her, and the first wife ends up being burned to death along with her father, along with everything they owned. But instead of that, instead of threatening Delilah, they come to Delilah. Now, maybe Delilah is higher up on the food chain. Maybe she's got a more status in the village or in the town. We don't know. But they offer her, instead of threatening her, they offer her wealth. If you do this for us, we will make you very wealthy. So, it doesn't say there's any argument or anything else. A little while later, Samson is there, and we find out that they have the Philistines are hiding in a different room. They're hiding in there, being very quiet, so Samson doesn't know they're there. And Delilah comes to Samson then and tells him, "Please tell me what makes your strength so great. How can you be bound so that we can subdue you?" And Samson gives her this story about 7 fresh bowstrings. Just so you know, this would be a what do they call it? A ligament. This would be a piece of well, this would be something that would be fresh. It'd be right off the animal, and it's used for bowstrings, because it has a little bit of flexibility to it. And then once it dries out, it becomes brittle and unusable. So that's what the fresh bowstrings are. They're actually the ligaments of an animal. And so they provide her with these 7 bowstrings, because she wouldn't have any reason to have 7 bowstrings laying around. So they give her 7 bowstrings. It's interesting to me in some ways that Samson responds to this, that he actually gives her an answer. Although it's a false answer, he still gives her an answer. Now, maybe he's thinking, well, this is going to be a good bondage game, a little bondage, a little of that. He can enjoy that, maybe. That's what he's thinking, that Delilah is into bondage. We don't know. But he seems to readily go along with this idea. And in fact, he does it again here in a few minutes. And so he goes along with this idea of, here, you can bind me up. And that's what she does. She binds him up. And then maybe as he's dozing off or he's relaxing there and they're playing their little games, all of a sudden she hollers out here that the Philistines are on him. And of course he just snaps it. He snaps the bowstrings. And what we note here, what you need to truly note, is that the Philistines don't come out of the secret room. And so no attack actually happened. There's no fight going on in the house. There's no brawl happening inside of Delilah's house or wherever he's meeting with her. So they stayed secret. And so he snaps the bowstrings. Ah ha ha, big joke. Everything's cool. Nobody's upset here because nobody attacked. And so he's still thinking, maybe he's still thinking this is a fun game that Delilah likes playing. We'll find out in the next section. So picking up now with verse 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you could be bound." He said to her, "If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." The men lying in wait were in the inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. So, we have the second incident here where Samson says, here's how this works. So Delilah comes to him, "You've mocked me, you've told me this, you told me a lie. Please tell me how you can be bound." "Well, if they bind me with new ropes." Now, if you remember, he was arrested by the Judahites, by the men of Judah, to be turned back over to the Philistines in the last scene, in our last episode. The men of Judah came to him while he's hiding in the cave, or in the cleft of the rock. They come to him, and he says, well, okay, you can bind me as long as you don't kill me. And they said, no, we won't kill you. We'll turn you over to them. And they bind him with 2 new ropes. So again, here is he's brought that back out. He says, if you use me new ropes. Now remember, when he was arrested with Judah, then as we see here, he could have broken himself free easily under the Judites, and he went along willingly in that episode. Of course, once he's confronted with the Philistines, he snaps the ropes and kills them all. But by then, the men of Judah have left. He's been turned over to the Philistines. He's completely under Philistine control, and he kills every one of them. So none of them really know that this rope thing isn't true, that the ropes will not bind him. They don't know that. And of course, Delilah doesn't know that at all. And so she takes 2 new ropes with her. She takes new ropes, and she binds him up with them. And again, maybe Samson's playing along with this because he likes the game. I don't know. We don't know, but I'm kind of believing that he likes the game. Well, we find out in a little parenthetical note here that the men are still lying in wait in the inner chamber. So they've come back, they're hiding in the inner chamber, and Delilah goes through this again. And of course, when she tells him that the Philistines are upon him, he snaps the ropes. Didn't work a second time. So picking up now with verse 13. Then Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you could be bound. He said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web and make it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web and made them tight with the pin. Then she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. So now we have the third one, the third incident where she tries to get him subdued. And so she comes to him again. Now she pleads with him again. Now you've mocked me again. You told me lies again. Tell me how you could be bound. Samson playing the game along. But I want you to note here that he gets a little bit closer to the truth. This time he actually mentions and brings out his hair. And so he's actually coming a little bit closer to the truth of this, of how he has his strength. So how can I bind you? As she asks again, how can we be bound? And so playing along, if you weave the 7 locks of my hair. So he has 7 braids in his hair. And from some of the descriptions that we have of his, it's probably like he has, his hair is braided into 7 braids, and then those 7 braids are woven into a large lump, a large clump. And in our modern day, I've seen that hairstyle, and it's kind of an interesting hairstyle, and that's kind of the presentation that we're receiving here is that he has 7 braids and they're woven together. But here what he says is, if you take the 7 braids of my hair and you weave them into a weaver's, or into the weaver's machinery here, into the weaver's loom. If you weave me into the loom, my hair into the womb, then that will it'll destroy my strength. It'll make my strength go away. If you weave it into the web and make it tight with the pin, and so if you weave it in there really tight and then you tighten it all up, that will do it. So that's what she does. She weaves his hair into the loom. She ties it up and she brings it in and she does exactly what he says will work. And she says the Philistines are upon him, and he wakes up and he just pulls the whole thing apart. And again, the Philistines aren't actually. This time, though, we find out it doesn't say that the Philistines were actually there. So now she's trying to figure out, okay, the Philistines aren't there, but we're still trying to figure this out. So, attempt number 3 fails, and she continues now with verse 15. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me 3 times now and have not told me what makes your strength so great. Finally, After she had nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, he was tired to death. So he told her his whole secret and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite of God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me. I would become weak and be like anyone else." So here in our fourth scene of this, she comes to him and she says, "How can you say I love you?" Now she's gone deeper. She's using an argument even deeper than you lied to me. Why don't you tell me the truth? You've mocked me and told me lies. She says that instead of that, she says, "You say you love me, but then you're not with me. Your heart is not with me. You're not telling me the truth in this. You have mocked me 3 times now, and you have not told me what makes your strength so great." So in the fourth attempt here, he actually tells her the truth. But it's because now, and I didn't use this word, the scripture uses this word, that she nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, and he was tired to death. It's interesting, just as a kind of a side note here, is that tired to death. There are a couple of prophets that used that in the past, that all of the stuff that's been laid on them has made them tired to death. Elijah is one, as he's lying in the cave and he's complaining about how everything has gone to hell in a handbasket for him, and he actually uses almost those exact same words. He was tired to death of all of this. Well, Samson has nagged and nagged and nagged. He's been nagged and nagged until the point where he just can't stand it anymore. And he finally gives her the secret. "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me. I'd become weak like anyone else." So he has finally laid out the last restriction, the last thing that keeps him a Nazarite, that keeps him dedicated to God. Remember, he gave up the first one when he had the party, the festival for his wedding. That first thing, he broke his vow there, because festival means drinking, and so he was at a drinking party for his wedding. He also had entered into the vineyards, which is also against the rules. He touched grape or went into the vineyards where grapes are near. So he broke the first rule, which is don't touch strong drink and don't have anything to do with the grape. Then he broke the second rule, which is touch nothing dead or consume anything from the dead. When he first off killed the lion, and then came back and took honey out of its dead carcass, and so he broke the second of the Nazarite rules, and he made himself unclean by touching something dead. And here he finally breaks the third and most important of all the Nazarene vows, or the Nazarite vows, was to not cut your hair. And so he gives her finally the last piece of the puzzle, which will break his vows completely. So picking up now with verse 18. When Delilah realized that he had told her his whole secret, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "This time come up, for he has told his whole secret to me." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She let him fall asleep on her lap, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. He began to weaken, and his strength left him. Then she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson!" When he awoke from his sleep, he thought, "I will go out as the other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. So the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. So here Delilah realizes now, she recognizes the fact that he has finally told her his secret. And she calls to the lords of the Philistines. Just another little side note here. The word lords here, and as it appeared earlier also, and I didn't explain it then, but the word lord here is really, it would be better translated, the word that is actually used here is tyrant. And so the tyrants of the Philistines, which is the lords of the five leaders of the Philistines, are recognized in our passage as being tyrants. Well, anyway, she calls them and says, he's finally told me the secret. And so the Philistines come to her and they bring the money in their hands. And again, they're hiding in another room. Well, she calls in then, she doesn't cut his hair, she calls in a barber. And maybe it's because, she's afraid that she'll wake him up halfway through it. He'll still be strong because but she calls in a professional hair cutter who comes in and shaves off the 7 locks of his head. And as they're coming off, he begins to weaken and his strength leaves him. Then she wakes him up because he's apparently dozed off. He's gone to sleep. The Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he wakes up thinking he can just do, thinking this still is part of the bondage game that she's playing here. He's thinking in his head, I'll just shake this off and we'll have some fun and that'll be the end of it. But he doesn't know that God has left him. His strength is in the story is presenting to us that his strength is in his hair. But his strength was really in the vows that he had been given and that he had honored up to this point. And when he finally gives up that last vow, that final vow, and that it's stripped of him of that final vow, then the Spirit of God, that almighty, powerful Spirit of God that really only manifested itself in his strength. It didn't give him wisdom in combat. It didn't give him all kinds of other attributes. All it did, all that power of God that entered into him, it was that thunder God, part of God that entered into him. That's the part that left. And that was the only part that was in Samson, was that strength, that power of God that was given to him. And so as that leaves him, he's now left without Adonai in his spirit or in his life. So the Philistines seize him and they gouged out his eyes. I know that that's a really horrible thing to hear, but there's a reason why that took place. Well, first off, there is just a historical reason why is you take if you gouge out the eyes of a great warrior, he becomes worthless. He's not a warrior anymore. He lost his ability because it's difficult to fight blind. So that's part of it, but part of it too has to do with the story itself, the storyline itself, because if you go backwards and you look at the very first story of Samson here, it's the woman caught his eye, and what he saw became more important than anything else. What he saw and his acquiring of what he saw became more important than anything else. And as we move forward with the stories in Judges, as we move into the next stage of this, past the Samson story, we see that people doing what was right in their own eyes becomes the major theme, starting with the next chapter. And so at this point here now, it's just being pointed out here is that they gouged out his eyes, which is representative here of, first off, it takes away his ability to fight, but second, it also plays into the theme that's coming up, was that what he saw are things that he wanted and things that he took. And so what was good in his own eyes became more important than what was good in the eyes of God. And here is the beginning of that theme, or at least a pointing to that theme that comes up in our next chapter. Well, they bring him down to Gaza, they bind him in bronze shackles, and he is put in prison where he grinds the grain. And he just pushes this large circular stone around day after day, minute after minute, hour after hour, grinding grain. And this is would be a normal thing for a prisoner of state. This is menial work. This is slave work. This is prisoner work. This is woman's work. Is grinding grain, and so he's given a job that is both woman's work, prisoner work, slave work, the lowest level. And that's what he's been given to do. But the story gives us a moment of hope here, that his hair is beginning to grow again after it had been shaved off. There is that spark of moment here that there is still possibilities coming. Picking up now with verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon, and to rejoice. For they said, Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. When the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And when their hearts were merry, they said, Call Samson, and let him entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. They made him stand between the pillars. And Samson said to the attendant who held him by the hand, Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, so that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson performed. So the tyrants of the Philistines, the lords of the Philistines, they gather maybe at the defeat of Samson, or maybe this is just part of an annual festival that they're doing, but they're going to have a great sacrifice to the god Dagon. Which is just kind of interesting, is because Dagon was a god of the Canaanites. He wasn't necessarily a god of the Philistines. But I guess at Gaza, when the Philistines drove the Canaanites out of that territory, out of the Gaza region, the Philistines accepted the Canaanite god Dagon in their spot. The god of the Philistines was Molech, not Dagon. And so that's just kind of an interesting little thing here, is that they're... but again, that also plays into the idea that the God of this place is not the God of that place, and if you take over this territory here, you have to accept the God that is there. You can't bring your gods with you. Only the Israelites bring their God with them. That is just not part of how the rest of the Middle Eastern world works in that day. In that day, the God of this place is the God of this place, and the God of that other place is the God of that other place. And if these two gods are warring, then people get involved with the wars, because the people carry out the God's wars. And if my people and my God are stronger than your people and your God, then we can conquer you. So they're having this festival to Dagon, and part of that festival is in celebration of them gathering Samson, who is the enemy of their people. It is interesting that Samson has been, again, I mentioned it earlier, but Samson's been elevated to the point that he is an enemy of the state. He's not just an enemy of the people in this little town or that place or this other place. He's actually an enemy of the state. And so they want at the festival here says, well, let's bring Samson out and we'll make him dance for us. And the word perform here can be very easily translated into the word danced. And so, in fact, the word performed here is the same word that describes what David was doing as he was celebrating his victory, as he was returning to Jerusalem, where his wife sees him and complains about how he's acting like a fool. But it's the same word, is that he was performing, he was dancing in front of God. Well, here they want Samson to dance for them, to perform for them, and this is because they're happy, because this is a guy that has that killed a lot of them and everything else, and so they're really happy that he's been captured, and they want a celebration of this. So they call for him to be dragged out of prison, off of his mill, and be forced to perform, to dance for them. So they bring him into this arena, And there are two pillars in the arena that are the main pillars that kind of hold this thing up, and they make Samson stand between these two because that's the central location, so that everybody could see him perform. And Samson tells the attendants with him, and again, because he can't see, there's somebody that guides him out there to make him, and he holds him by the hand and leads him out. And Samson says, take me by the hand and let me touch the pillars. Let me feel the pillars, and so that I can rest on them. I can lean against them and rest. So he's kind of expressing to this attendant here, I'm really tired, I'm exhausted, just guide me a place where I can rest for a moment. So he leans them, so he takes them there, and we find out that the house is full of men and women, all the lords, all the tyrants of the Philistines, all the lords of all five of the kings of the Philistines are there. And that up on the roof there is a arena setting where there are about 3,000 people sitting up on top, looking down inside to the arena, watching Samson perform. Finishing our story, beginning with verse 28. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, Lord God, remember me and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that with this one act of revenge I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Then Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. He strained with all his might, and the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. So, Samson then, now he's standing there in the arena and he's performed for them and he's had the attendant lean him up against it, and we found out that there are 3,000 people up in the stands watching. Incidentally, I want you to remember the number 3,000 here, because as we backed up, remember we started off with 3 and then 30 and then 300 and now 3,000. And so the number 3 has expanded through the whole story till finally he has killed 3,000 in the end. 3,000 plus, because there was also the lords and the ladies that were in the lower part of this auditorium. So in this act of revenge, he wants to pay back the Philistines for his 2 eyes. In this one act of vengeance or in revenge of what's going on, is seeking a retribution for the 2 wrongs that were done to him, his 2 eyes. So Samson grabs the 2 middle pillars and he strains and he pushes them and it doesn't say he screams out here, but he says, "Let me die with the Philistines," and he strains with all his might and the place falls. And he kills 3,000 of them during, in his final act of defiance against the Philistines. He kills 3,000 plus. We find out his brothers. We find out he has brothers. Remember, he's the firstborn, but apparently his Manoah and his mother had more children after that. And so his brothers, but again, the brothers here could also be his relatives, other relatives. It could be cousins. The word brothers here is relatives, not necessarily, physical brother. And so it could be that it's just his relatives come, that Manoah and his wife his unnamed wife never had any more. But I'm kind of believing that they had a full life after this. And his brothers came, and all of his family came down, and they take him and they bury him in a sacred place, where his father is buried. And we have that final statement here, he had judged Israel 20 years. That's the second time we've seen that. We note here also that there was no peace, there was no rest, there was just, he judged Israel for 20 years and then he died. But when Samson died, he left the Israelites still under the oppression of the Philistines. which plays into our story as we move forward, past Judges, past Ruth, and on into 1 Samuel. We see that the Philistines in 1 Samuel are still the major opponent of the Israelite people. And so Samson, although he irritated them, enraged them, and even killed off several thousands of them, they're still the oppressor as we move forward through our stories. Well, I want to thank you for joining my class this week. I do want to apologize for sending it out to you so late, getting a week. You had a week break between classes. Last week I filmed this on Tuesday as I normally did, and as I went to edit it Tuesday night and put it up on the air so that you could have it by Wednesday morning, I discovered that I had failed to turn on my microphone. And so there was about an hour or so of me just mouthing words to you without you being able to hear me. And so that really just it broke my week. I have to be honest with you about it. It broke my week. Which really didn't help me, because then I didn't get my Sunday service out either until Monday, and that's because I filmed the Gold Hill service so I could edit it and post it on Monday. So last week was a bump week, and I apologize for that, but we got the class out this week, and next week we will pick up with the next chapter of Judges. As we move forward, we'll find that there are no more judges. What we have next are some stories about priests, about Levites, and about, then we also have a civil war that happens toward the end of this book. So as we move forward next week, I look forward to the class. I look forward to seeing you again. Although I don't really see you, I know that you see me, and that's enough for the moment. And so thank you, and God bless you. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And all God's people said, amen.